Welcome to Story of the Murder Beneath Gaslight Bridge. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1. The Body Beneath the Bridge. The fog that crept along the Thames on the morning of the 14th of November was of the particular variety that Watson, in his years of London residence, had come to think of as malicious. It did not merely obscure, it invaded. It pressed against the window panes of 221B Baker Street with the slow insistence of a man who knows he will eventually be let in, and it carried with it the cold, mineral stench of the river, and something else beneath it, something older and less pleasant, as though the city itself were exhaling through clenched teeth. Watson had risen early that morning, driven from sleep by the dull ache in his shoulder that always announced a change in the weather. He found Holmes already seated at the breakfast table, though seated was perhaps too generous a word. Holmes was draped across the chair in that peculiar arrangement of limbs that suggested a man who had been poured into place, rather than one who had chosen to sit. He was reading 3 newspapers simultaneously, or at least had arranged them so that such a thing appeared possible, and he had not touched his eggs. "You slept badly," Holmes remarked without looking up. "The shoulder again. You rolled onto it twice before 4 o'clock, judging by the state of your collar, which you buttoned crookedly and then corrected, but only 2 of the 3 misaligned buttons. The third, Watson, remains a testament to your discomfort." Watson glanced down. The third button was, indeed, off by 1 hole. He corrected it without comment, and sat down. "The fog is dreadful," Watson said, more to fill the silence than from any expectation of agreement. "The fog is useful," Holmes replied. "It keeps idle visitors away." "I've had 3 days without a client, Watson, and I confess the quiet has begun to press upon me more heavily than any fog. If something does not present itself by noon, I shall be forced to take up the violin, and neither of us wants that at this hour." It was precisely then that they heard the bell, followed by the heavy, deliberate tread of boots on the stair, boots that belonged to a man accustomed to climbing steps in other people's houses without invitation. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose in faint protest, and then the door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered the room with his hat in one hand, and a look on his face that Watson had seen many times before. It was the look of a man who had come to ask for help and resented the necessity. "Lestrade," Holmes said, folding one of the newspapers with sudden precision. "You have been down by the river, Southwark side, unless I am mistaken. The mud on your left boot is of the particular chalyte clay found only along that stretch between Blackfriars and London Bridge. You have not had breakfast, you have not slept, and the matter is a body. Not a theft, not a fraud, but a body. A man's body. I was given the weight of your expression. Sit down, and tell me what the regular force has failed to make sense of." Lestrade sat. He placed his hat on his knee, and regarded Holmes with the practised tolerance of a man who has long since stopped being surprised. "A clerk from the Foreign Office," Lestrade said. "Name of Edmund Fairley, 31 years of age. Found this morning at 6:15 by a bargeman working the mud flats beneath Gaslight Bridge. The body was lying face up in the Thames mud, partially submerged. At first look it seemed a simple enough matter, a man who'd had too much to drink and fallen from the bridge in the dark. The railing along that stretch is low. It's happened before." "But you are here," Holmes observed, "which means it has not happened in the way you describe." "No," Lestrade admitted. It has not." He shifted in the chair. The man's valuables were untouched. His wallet contained £7 and change. His watch, a pocket watch, was still in his waistcoat, though the glass was cracked and it had stopped. But it was the wound that troubled me. A single blow to the right temple. Crushing force. The police surgeon says a fall from the bridge onto mud would not produce that kind of injury. Not from that height, not at that angle. The wound is localized. clean, the sort of thing you'd get from a heavy instrument swung with deliberate force. Holmes had risen from the table. The newspapers were forgotten. His eyes had taken on that particular brightness that Watson recognized as the first spark of genuine interest, a look that transformed his lean features from languor to something almost predatory. "The watch," Holmes said. "What time had it stopped?" 11:47, in the evening, presumably. And the valuables were intact. No robbery, no defensive wounds on the hands or arms. None. The surgeon confirmed it. The man did not fight. "He did not see the blow coming," Holmes murmured, "or he trusted the man who delivered it." He crossed to the window and drew aside the curtain. The fog stared back at him, featureless and grey. "You mentioned Gaslight Bridge. I presume there are gas lamps along its length." 18, Lestrade said. "I counted them myself this morning, all burning except one, the lamp directly above the spot where the body was found. Dead. Cold. Not a flicker." Holmes turned from the window. The change in his posture was immediate and unmistakable. Where a moment before he had been merely interested, and he was now fully engaged, his shoulders drawn back, his chin lifted, his fingers pressed together at their tips in that cathedral gesture that Watson had come to associate with the sharpest edge of his concentration. "One lamp in 18, Holmes said quietly. "And it is the one that stands above a dead man. That is not coincidence, Lestrade. That is preparation." He paused. "You will take us to the bridge." "I'd hoped you'd say that," Lestrade replied, with something that was almost relief. They travelled by cab through the choking fog, the horse finding its way more by habit than by sight. Watson sat opposite Holmes and watched his friend's face in the grey half-light that filtered through the cab window. Holmes said nothing during the journey. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance that existed only inside his own mind. And his fingers drummed a silent rhythm against the arm of the seat. Not the rhythm of impatience, Watson noted, but the rhythm of a man arranging facts into preliminary order. Gaslight Bridge was a modest iron span that crossed the Thames at an angle between Southwark and the city, carrying foot traffic and the occasional cart. In daylight, even through fog, it was an unremarkable structure, functional, unlovely, its railings low and its lamps spaced at regular intervals along both sides. 17 of those lamps still burned with their steady yellow glow, guttering faintly in the damp air. The 18th, positioned almost precisely at the centre of the bridge on the eastern rail, was dark. Holmes was out of the cab before it had fully stopped. He did not proceed directly to the body, which still lay below, attended by 2 constables and awaiting the mortuary wagon, but instead walked to the dark lamp and stood beneath it, looking up. "Watson," he said, "tell me what you see." Watson joined him and examined the lamp. It was identical in design to the other 17, a cast-iron post with a glass housing and a simple gas valve mechanism at its base. The glass was intact. There was no obvious damage. "I see nothing out of the ordinary," Watson confessed. "Precisely the correct observation and precisely the wrong conclusion," Holmes replied. He produced a magnifying lens from his coat and crouched at the base of the lamp-post. For a long moment he examined the valve housing in silence. Then he straightened. "There are scratches here," he said, indicating the brass fitting around the valve. "Fine scratches, recent. Made by a tool that does not quite fit the mechanism. The lamplighter who services this bridge uses a standard corporation key, a specific instrument designed for these valves. These marks were made by something else, something improvised, or something designed for a different purpose that was pressed into service here." He looked at Lestrade. "Someone turned this lamp off after the lamplighter's round. They extinguished it deliberately to create darkness at this specific point on the bridge." Lestrade frowned. "You're saying the killer planned this? Came here beforehand and put out the lamp?" "I am saying that whoever killed Edmund Fairley did not act on impulse. He chose this bridge. He chose this spot, and he manufactured the conditions he needed. A pocket of darkness on an otherwise well-lit span. A low railing. A river below. Holmes turned and walked to the railing. He leaned over and looked down at the mud flat where the body lay. The fall is perhaps 20 feet into soft mud, not high enough to kill reliably, but enough to conceal a body until morning, especially in fog. They descended by a narrow stone staircase at the southern end of the bridge and made their way along the river bank to where the body of Edmund Fairley still lay. The bargeman who had found him, a stout, weathered man named Coggins, stood at a respectful distance, smoking a clay pipe and watching the proceedings with the air of a man who had seen unpleasant things pulled from the river before and expected to see them again. Fairley had been a slight man, fair-haired, clean-shaven, with the pallid complexion and ink-stained fingers of one who spent his days at a desk. He was dressed respectably, but not expensively. A dark wool suit, a waistcoat, a white shirt now stained brown with river mud. His face bore the single wound Lestrade had described, a deep, concave fracture above the right temple, the skin broken and darkened with dried blood. It was, as the inspector had said, a precise injury. Not the ragged damage of a fall, but the focused destruction of a single powerful blow. Holmes knelt beside the body. He examined the wound first, then the hands, then the clothing, moving with the methodical patience of a man reading a text, written in a language only he could fully understand. Watson watched, notebook in hand, recording what he could. The blow was delivered from the front and slightly to the right, Holmes said. The assailant was facing him, standing close, within arm's reach. The weapon was heavy, smooth and rounded, not a hammer, not a stone. Something carried openly. A walking stick, perhaps, or a cane with a weighted head. He examined Fairley's hands. No skin under the fingernails, no bruising on the knuckles or forearms. He did not resist. He did not even raise his hands. He knew his killer, Watson said. He expected his killer, Holmes corrected. There is a difference. A man who knows his killer may still flinch. A man who expects a companion does not raise his guard. Fairley walked to the centre of that bridge, to that particular dark spot, to meet someone he believed he was doing business with. And that person struck him before the transaction, or whatever it was complete. Holmes moved to the shoes. He turned the body slightly, examining the soles, and then, with a flicker of interest so brief that only Watson caught it, the tops of the shoes. He said nothing about this, but Watson saw him file the observation away. Lestrade, Holmes said, straightening, have your men searched the mud within a radius of 30 feet. If the weapon was discarded, it may be here, though I doubt it. A man who plans this carefully does not abandon his instruments. He looked up at the dark lamp on the bridge above them. In the fog it was barely visible, a shadow among shadows, indistinguishable from its 17 burning companions except for the absence at its heart. This was neither robbery nor accident, Holmes said. It was not a crime of passion, and it was not the work of a common thug. This was calculated, Lestrade. Someone studied this bridge, selected this spot, extinguished that lamp, and waited in the darkness for a man who came willingly to his own death. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice carried the quiet certainty that Watson had learned never to doubt. Edmund Fairley was murdered, and the man who killed him is still in London. He is calm, he is methodical, and he believes he has left nothing behind. Holmes glanced once more at the dark lamp above. He is wrong. Chapter 2. A Curious Pocket. The mortuary at St. Thomas's Hospital was a place that Watson had visited more often than any physician would care to admit, for reasons unrelated to the healing arts. It was a low-ceilinged room of white tile and institutional silence, lit by high windows that admitted the grey daylight in thin, reluctant slices. The air carried the permanent smell of carbolic acid, and something colder beneath it. the mineral stillness of bodies that had ceased to generate warmth. Watson had learned, over many years and many cases, to set aside the physician's instinct to intervene and adopt instead the investigator's colder discipline of observation. It was not a transition he had ever grown comfortable with, and he suspected he never would. Holmes, by contrast, moved through the mortuary with the focused ease of a man entering his study. He removed his coat, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and approached the slab where Edmund Fairley had been laid out with the same expression Watson had seen him bring to a particularly interesting monograph, alert, precise, and entirely devoid of sentiment. The police surgeon, a competent but unimaginative man named Hollins, had completed his preliminary examination and stood now at a respectful distance, his report in hand. He offered it to Holmes, who ignored it, and instead began his own examination from the feet upward. "The shoes first," Holmes murmured. He lifted each foot in turn, studying the soles through his lens. Thames mud, consistent with where he was found. But note this, Watson. He angled the right shoe so that Watson could see the upper surface of the toe. A thin crust of dried mud covered the leather from the toe cap to just past the lacing. Mud on the top of the shoe, not the sole alone, not the heel, the top. "He stumbled?" Watson offered. "A man who stumbles scuffs the toe. He does not coat the entire upper surface evenly. This pattern is consistent with the foot being dragged across wet ground while the body lies face down. Someone moved Fairley after he fell, dragged him a short distance before lifting him over the railing." Holmes set the foot down gently. This was not a man who toppled from a bridge. This was a man who was struck, who collapsed, and who was then repositioned and dropped. The killer was thorough, Watson, but he was working quickly and in darkness. The mud tells us what the darkness was meant to hide. Holmes moved to the hands. He examined each finger under the lens, then the palms, then the wrists. No defensive injuries, no bruising, no fragments beneath the nails. Fairley did not struggle. He did not even clench his fists. He straightened and looked at Watson with an expression that was less satisfaction than confirmation. He was struck, without warning, by someone standing directly in front of him, someone he had no reason to fear, or someone he could not see, Watson said. "The lamp," Holmes replied, nodding. "Yes, in absolute darkness, even a trusted companion becomes invisible. But consider, Fairley walked to the centre of that bridge voluntarily. He walked to the one unlit section. He was keeping an appointment, Watson. He expected to meet someone in that darkness, and he did." Holmes turned his attention to the wound itself. He examined the fracture at the right temple for a long while. It's measuring its dimensions with a small caliper he produced from his waistcoat. Roughly 2 inches in diameter, concave. The bone is depressed in a smooth, curved pattern, not the jagged fracture of a stone or the flat compression of a plank. This was delivered by something rounded and heavy, brass or iron. The surface was polished. There are no rough abrasions around the wound edge. He looked at Hollins. "Have you recovered any metallic traces from the wound?" Hollins consulted his notes. "A faint greenish residue in the tissue surrounding the fracture. I assumed it was river contamination." "It is not," Holmes said. "It is the oxidation of brass. Your murder weapon, Lestrade, is a brass-headed instrument, most likely a walking cane or a gentleman's stick. Heavy enough to fracture the temporal bone with a single blow. Carried openly, attracting no attention, the sort of thing a man of standing carries every day without remark." Lestrade, who had been standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression balanced between scepticism and grudging attention, stepped forward. "A gentleman's cane. So we are looking for a man of means." "We are looking for a man who wishes to appear as one," Holmes corrected. "The two are not always identical." He turned from the body and moved to the table where Fairley's personal effects had been arranged. Now, let us see what a dead man's pockets have to tell us. The effects were modest. A leather wallet containing £7, 4 shillings, and a receipt from a bookseller in the Strand. A ring of 3 keys. Lodging, desk, and 1 unidentified. A handkerchief, clean and folded. A pencil, sharpened but unused. And 3 items that Holmes separated from the rest and arranged in a line on the table with the deliberate care of a man laying out cards. The first was the pocket watch. Holmes held it to the light and examined the cracked glass. The hands had stopped at 11:47. He turned the watch over, then brought the lens to the face once more. "Observe the crack," he said, holding it for Watson. The glass was fractured in a starburst pattern, the lines radiating outward from a single point of impact near the 9 o'clock position on the face of the watch, not the back. If a man falls from a bridge and lands on his chest, the impact strikes the back of the watch where it sits against the body. The glass might crack from the force transmitted through the casing, but this crack originates from the front. From the face, something struck the watch from the outside while it sat in his waistcoat pocket. "The same blow that killed him?" Watson asked. "Or a consequence of it?" The cane struck the temple and fairly collapsed forward. As he fell, the watch struck something. The railing, the cane itself, the killer's knee. The glass broke from the front and the mechanism stopped. 11:47. "We have our time of death, Watson, and we have confirmation that the damage was caused by violence, not by the fall into the river." The second item was a visiting card. It was a fine card, cream-coloured, with an engraved name that Holmes read aloud: Marcus Keaton, MP. Below the name, in smaller type, was an address in Westminster. Holmes turned the card over. On the reverse, in pencil, someone had written a single line, a date and a time that corresponded to the afternoon of the previous day. "Marcus Keaton," Lestrade said, leaning in. "I know the name. Member of Parliament, Foreign Affairs Committee, if I'm not mistaken. You think he arranged the meeting on the bridge?" "I think his card was in a dead man's pocket," Holmes replied, "which is a fact, not a theory. The penciled note on the reverse suggests an appointment, but it refers to yesterday afternoon, not to the evening. This card may indicate the last person to see Fairley alive, or it may indicate nothing more than that Fairley met a politician during business hours and kept his card. A killer, Lestrade, does not typically leave his own calling card upon the body of his victim. It would be rather poor form." "Then why keep it?" Lestrade pressed. "Because Fairley was a secretary at the Foreign Office, and secretaries meet politicians as a matter of routine. The card tells us that Keaton and Fairley had contact. It does not tell us why Fairley was standing on a dark bridge 6 hours later." Holmes set the card aside. "We shall speak to Mr. Keaton, but I would not arrest him on the strength of good stationery." The third item was an envelope. It was small, the kind used for brief personal correspondence, and it was empty. No letter, no enclosure, no stamp. It had not been posted. Holmes held it to the light and studied the surface with his lens for a full minute before speaking. "There is an impression on the paper," he said. "Someone wrote on a slip that rested on top of this envelope, and the pressure of the pen transferred a faint mark." He tilted the envelope at an angle to the window. A number, 11:45. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mortuary air. "The meeting time." "The meeting time," Holmes confirmed. "Written on a separate slip, now missing, taken by the killer or lost in the river. And the ghost of it left behind on the envelope beneath. The envelope itself is more interesting still. Feel the weight of the paper, Watson. This is not cheap stationery. It is government stock, the same bond paper used by the Foreign Office for internal correspondence. And the interior..." He opened the envelope and held it to Watson's nose. "Faint, very faint, but present. The smell of fresh ink, the particular iron gall compound used in official documents. This envelope held something recently written or recently copied, a document of some kind, and that document is now gone. Holmes laid the 3 items in a row, the stopped watch, the visiting card, the empty envelope, and stood back, regarding them as a painter might regard an unfinished canvas. 3 objects, he said. The watch gives us the time, 11:47. The card gives us a name, Marcus Keaton. The envelope gives us a purpose. A document was carried to that bridge and taken from the body. Fairley was not robbed of his money, Watson. He was robbed of something far more valuable, something he brought with him voluntarily, something he intended to hand over. "You believe he was selling a document?" Watson asked. "I believe he was exchanging one. Whether for money, for favour, or for some other consideration, I cannot yet say. But the architecture of this crime is becoming visible. A man steals a document from his own office. He arranges a midnight meeting on a bridge. He carries the document in a government envelope. He arrives at the appointed time, and he is struck dead by the person he came to meet, who takes the document and leaves everything else untouched." Holmes retrieved his coat and began rolling down his sleeves. "The question that remains is not merely who killed Edmund Fairley. It is what document was worth killing for, and who in London needed it badly enough to darken a lamp, wait in the cold, and crush a man's skull to obtain it." He paused at the door and looked back at the 3 items on the table: the broken watch, the politician's card, the empty envelope. 3 relics of a dead man's last evening, each one a sentence in a story that had not yet been fully read. "Come, Watson," Holmes said. "We have a great many questions to ask, and the fog, I suspect, is not yet ready to lift." Chapter 3. The Lamp That Never Burned. Holmes did not return to Baker Street that afternoon. Instead, he directed the cab back to Gaslight Bridge, and Watson, who had learned long ago that the most useful thing he could do at such moments was to follow without asking questions that would not yet be answered, went with him. The fog had thinned to a grey haze that hung at shoulder height, lending the bridge an oddly decapitated appearance. Its iron railings visible, its lamps ghostly, its far end dissolving into nothing. The constables who had guarded the scene that morning were gone, and the body with them. What remained was the bridge itself, the river below it, and the single dark lamp that stood at its centre like a wound that refused to close. Holmes walked the full length of the bridge from the north end to the south, counting under his breath. Watson walked beside him and counted as well. 18 lamps, 9 on the eastern rail, 9 on the western. They burned with a steady amber glow, each one casting a pool of light that overlapped faintly with its neighbours, so that the bridge was never entirely dark, except at one point. The 9th lamp on the eastern rail, positioned almost precisely at the centre of the span, was dead. Its glass housing was intact, its iron post unmarked, but its flame was absent, and the darkness it left behind was striking in its completeness. Standing beneath it, Watson could barely see Holmes's face at arm's length. "Remarkable," Watson said. "One would hardly notice it from either end of the bridge, but standing here, in the gap, it is as though someone has cut a hole in the light." "That is precisely what someone has done," Holmes replied. He crouched at the base of the lamp-post and produced his lens once more. In the stronger light of afternoon, what little the fog permitted, the scratches he had noted that morning were more clearly visible. They ringed the brass collar of the gas valve in a series of short, angular marks, each one a fraction of an inch long, clustered on the left side of the fitting. "A valve key turns this mechanism," Holmes said, indicating the hexagonal nut that controlled the gas flow. "The lamplighter uses a standard corporation key, a T-shaped tool with a socket that fits the nut precisely. And these scratches were not made by such a tool. They were made by something that did not quite fit, something with a slightly wider socket, or a socket intended for a different gauge of fitting. The tool slipped repeatedly before finding its grip." He straightened. "Someone who was not the lamplighter turned this valve. Someone who had the right general idea but the wrong specific instrument. Could it have malfunctioned? Watson asked. A faulty valve, a gust of wind through a crack in the glass. The glass is intact. The valve, when I tested it this morning, moves freely and holds its position, and the wind, Watson, does not leave scratches on brass. Holmes looked along the bridge toward the Southwark end. No, this lamp was extinguished by hand, after the lamplighter's round, by a person who carried a tool for the purpose. The question is whether that person brought the tool with him, or obtained it locally. They found the lamplighter at a public house called the Anchor and Crown, 3 streets south of the bridge. His name was Samuel Cope, and he was a small, weathered man of perhaps 50, with the permanently reddened hands of one who works outdoors in all seasons, and the careful, slightly offended manner of a man who has been asked to account for his competence. "I lit every lamp, sir," Cope said, before Holmes had finished introducing himself. "Every one. 18 lamps on Gaslight Bridge, and I lit them all. I've done that route for 11 years, and I've never missed one, not once. You can ask anyone." "I do not doubt you," Holmes said, with a gentleness that Watson recognised as strategic rather than sentimental. "I believe you lit all 18 lamps. What I am asking is whether someone extinguished one of them after you had gone." Cope's indignation softened into something closer to confusion. "After I'd gone? Who would do that?" "That is what I am attempting to determine. Tell me, what time did you complete your round on the bridge that evening?" 9:30, perhaps 9:45. I start at the south end and work north. Gaslight Bridge is 3rd on my route. I light the western rail going up and the eastern rail coming back. The 9th lamp on the east side, the one you're asking about, would have been the last I lit on the bridge. I remember it burning when I crossed back to the south bank. "And the tool you use, describe it." Cope reached into his coat and produced the key. It was a simple instrument, a steel shaft perhaps 8 inches long, with a T-shaped handle at one end and a hexagonal socket at the other. The socket was clean, well worn and fitted to a specific gauge. Holmes examined it briefly and handed it back. "You keep this on your person at all times?" "While I'm working, yes. It goes back to the maintenance shed when I'm done for the night. We've got 3 of them, 2 in regular use and a spare." Holmes's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "A spare. Where is the spare kept?" "In the shed, hanging on a nail by the door. It's been there as long as I can remember." Cope paused. "Or it was. I noticed 3 days ago it was gone. I mentioned it to the foreman, but he said it would turn up. Tools go walking sometimes. The apprentices borrow things and forget to bring them back." 3 days ago," Holmes repeated. "And the shed, where is it located?" "Bankside, just off Emerson Street. It's a small brick building. We keep the keys, the oil, the wicks, the ladders. Nothing valuable, really. The door has a lock, but half the time it isn't fastened. No reason to steal a valve key, is there? You can't sell one. It's only good for one thing." Holmes thanked Cope and they left the public house. Outside, in the damp afternoon air, Holmes stood for a moment on the pavement with his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on nothing Watson could identify. "The spare key was taken 3 days before the murder," Holmes said. "Taken from an unsecured shed on Bankside. Not by an apprentice. Not by a man who forgot to return it. By a man who needed it for one very specific purpose, to extinguish a single gas lamp on a bridge where he intended to kill another man in darkness." He began walking. "The shed on Emerson Street. Let us see what else it can tell us." The maintenance shed was exactly as Cope had described, a small, soot-darkened brick building, tucked between a warehouse wall and a narrow alley. The door was fitted with a padlock that hung open on its hasp, and inside the shed was a cluttered but orderly space. Wooden shelves holding tins of whale oil, coils of wick, replacement glass panels, and a rack of tools mounted on nails along the back wall. 2 valve keys hung from their designated nails. A third nail, positioned between them, was empty. Holmes examined the empty nail, then the door, then the alley outside. He walked the length of the alley twice, studying the ground, the walls, the angles of approach. When he returned, he stood in the doorway of the shed and looked south, then north, then south again. His brow contracted. "Watson," he said, "what building is that? The large one at the end of this street behind the wall." Watson looked. Through the haze, perhaps 200 yards distant, a substantial stone building was visible behind a high wall topped with iron railings. A flag hung limp from a pole above the entrance, its colours indistinguishable in the fog. "I believe that is the Russian embassy," Watson said, "or rather, the service entrance to it. The main facade faces the next street." Holmes regarded it for a long moment, but said nothing about it, which Watson found more unsettling than any observation would have been. Instead, Holmes turned back to the shed's interior and examined the floor near the threshold. "Boot prints," he said. "Several sets, most of them consistent with working men, heavy soles, wide treads. But here, partially overlapping the others, a narrower print, a dress boot. Leather sole, slight heel. Not a lamplighter's boot, Watson. Not a workman's boot. The boot of a man who had no professional reason to enter this shed." Watson crouched beside Holmes and studied the print. His medical training had given him a passable understanding of anatomy, and he applied it now. "The stride is short," he said, tracing the distance between the heel impression and a second, fainter mark ahead of it. "A man of moderate height, and the weight distribution favours the left foot. See how the left impression is deeper? He may carry something heavy in his right hand, or he has an old injury to the right leg that causes him to compensate." Holmes looked at Watson with an expression of genuine approval, not the performative kind he sometimes offered to soften a correction, but the real article. "Very good, Watson. The left-heavy distribution is particularly astute. I had noted the depth, but not drawn the anatomical inference." He rose and dusted his hands. "We are looking for a man of moderate height, who favours his left side and wears dress boots. That eliminates a common labourer and narrows the field considerably." They returned to the bridge as the early dusk of November began to settle over the city. The lamps burned on, 17 steady flames and one empty post, and the river moved below in its slow, black, indifferent way. Holmes stood at the centre of the span, in the pocket of darkness beneath the dead lamp, and looked out over the water. "Consider what we know," he said. "Fairley was a trusted secretary at the Foreign Office. He removed a document, we do not yet know which one, and carried it to this bridge in a government envelope. He arrived at approximately midnight, as the impression on the envelope confirms. He met someone in this darkness, someone who had prepared the ground days in advance by stealing the valve key and extinguishing the lamp. That person struck Fairley with a brass-headed cane, took the document and tipped the body over the railing into the mud below." He paused. "The visiting card of Marcus Keaton sits in Fairley's pocket and demands our attention. A politician with connections to foreign affairs, whose name is linked to the dead man on the very night of his death. It is a compelling thread, Watson, and any competent inspector would follow it." "You intend to follow it," Watson said. "I intend to pull it," Holmes replied, "and see whether it leads to a knot or unravels into nothing. A card left in a dead man's pocket is either the most damning piece of evidence in this case or the most irrelevant. There's very little middle ground." He turned from the railing. "Tomorrow we visit the Foreign Office. I want to know what document is missing, and I want to know who had reason to want it. The lamp has told us how. The envelope has told us why. What remains is who. And the answer, Watson, is somewhere in the space between a politician's visiting card and a stolen valve key." They walked back through the thickening fog toward the Southwark end of the bridge, their footsteps ringing hollow on the iron deck. Behind them, the 17 lamps guttered and swayed in the damp air, their reflections shimmering on the wet surface of the bridge like small, uncertain prayers. The 18th lamp stood dark and silent at the centre, a deliberate absence, placed there by a hand that understood exactly what darkness could accomplish. Watson looked back once. In the fog, the dark lamp was already invisible. It had been swallowed whole, as though the night had reclaimed the space that had been taken from it, and was satisfied. Chapter 4. The Missing Document. The Foreign Office occupied a position on King Charles Street that was, in Watson's estimation, deliberately designed to make visitors feel small. The building announced itself in Portland stone and imperial confidence, its corridors long and echoing, its ceilings high enough to accommodate the ambitions of the men who worked beneath them. Holmes moved through it with the indifference of a man who had walked grander halls in pursuit of smaller truths, and the clerk who escorted them to the office of Fairley's supervisor struggled to maintain his composure under the weight of Holmes's reputation, which had evidently preceded them. The supervisor was a man named Reginald Harcourt, tall, thin, yet meticulously groomed, with a kind of face that seemed to have been designed specifically for the business of looking concerned, without revealing the precise nature of the concern. He rose when they entered, but did not offer his hand. He gestured instead toward 2 chairs arranged before his desk, with the careful hospitality of a man who expected the conversation to be unpleasant and wished to control its geometry. "Mr. Holmes," Harcourt said, "Inspector Lestrade informed me you would be calling. I must tell you at the outset that the Foreign Office takes this matter with the utmost seriousness. Edmund Fairley was a trusted member of this department. His death is a considerable shock." "His death?" Holmes replied, settling into the chair with that deceptive casualness Watson knew so well. "May prove to be rather less shocking than what he was doing in the hours before it. Tell me about Fairley's position here." Harcourt folded his hands on the desk. He was a senior secretary in the Diplomatic Correspondence Division. His role was primarily clerical, the handling, copying, filing and distribution of sensitive documents between this office and our embassies abroad. He had been with the department for 7 years. His record was exemplary. He was quiet, reliable and discreet, the very qualities one values most in a man who handles confidential material. And the material he handled? How confidential? Harcourt hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a breath, but Holmes caught it, and Watson saw him catch it. "Some of it was routine," Harcourt said carefully. "Trade agreements, consular dispatches, and diplomatic courtesies, but some of it was of a more sensitive nature. Naval arrangements, military liaisons, intelligence summaries from our attachés abroad." He paused again. "I must be candid with you, Mr. Holmes, because the alternative is worse. We have conducted an internal audit since learning of Fairley's death. A document is missing from the archives." The room seemed to contract slightly. Watson felt it, a tightening of the air as though the walls had drawn half an inch closer. "Which document?" Holmes asked. "A confidential memorandum concerning an Anglo-French naval accord. It was drafted jointly by this office and the French Foreign Ministry 6 weeks ago. The accord outlines a series of mutual obligations regarding fleet positioning in the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, ship numbers, patrol routes, resupply agreements, signal protocols. It is not, in the strictest sense, a military secret, but in the wrong hands it would reveal the precise disposition and capacity of both the British and French navies in those waters. Any foreign power with access to that information would gain a significant strategic advantage. And this document was accessible to Fairley? It was in the archive to which he held a key. The register shows it was last signed out 3 weeks ago by an undersecretary, who returned it the same day. There is no subsequent entry. But Fairley had unsupervised access to the archive during working hours. He could have removed the document at any time without being noticed, provided he did not sign the register. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window. He stood with his back to Harcourt, so looking out at the courtyard below, where 2 clerks were crossing the gravel path with their heads bowed against the cold. "Let me put the matter plainly," Holmes said, without turning. "Fairley stole the Anglo-French naval accord from this archive. He carried it to Gaslight Bridge on the night of the 13th of November, concealed in a government envelope. He intended to deliver it to someone, to sell it, or to exchange it for something he needed. And the person he met on that bridge killed him, took the document, and disappeared into the fog." Harcourt's face had gone very still. "You are certain?" "The evidence permits no other reading. The envelope found on his body was government stock. Your stock, Mr. Harcourt. It smelled of fresh iron gall ink. It had contained a document recently written or copied on official paper. And it was empty. Whatever Fairley carried to that bridge, he no longer had it when he died. Your missing accord and his empty envelope are two halves of the same fact." Harcourt lowered his gaze to the desk. For a moment, the mask of professional composure slipped, and what lay beneath it was not shock, but something older and wearier. The expression of a man who had always known, in some quiet chamber of his mind, that this kind of thing was possible, and had hoped it would happen on someone else's watch. "If the accord has reached a foreign intelligence service," Harcourt said quietly, "the consequences will be severe. The French will view it as a breach of trust. The naval arrangements will need to be redrawn entirely. And the political damage—" "The political damage," Holmes said, turning from the window, "is not my concern. What the murder is. I need to understand who knew about this document, who knew it existed, who knew its contents, and who might have had reason to acquire it." Harcourt considered this. Within this office, perhaps a dozen people knew of the accord's existence. Fairley was one. His colleague, Arthur Denholm, was another. They shared access to the same archive. On the political side, the accord was brokered with the involvement of several members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Marcus Keaton, the Member of Parliament, was instrumental in negotiating a particular concession regarding fleet access to French colonial ports. It was a controversial element. Keaton pushed it through without full cabinet approval, and there were those who felt he had overstepped. Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson saw the faintest contraction of his eyes, the look of a man who has just been handed a piece that fits into a space he had already prepared. "Keaton negotiated a concession without cabinet approval," Holmes repeated, "and this concession is documented in the accord that Fairley stole. It is. If the accord were made public, or worse, if it reached a foreign power, Keaton's role would be exposed. His career would not survive it." "Then Keaton had motive to suppress the document," Watson said. "If he knew Fairley had it, he might have—" "He might have done a great many things," Holmes interrupted gently. "But motive alone does not make a murderer, Watson. It merely makes a suspect." He turned back to Harcourt. "I will need a list of every person who had access to that archive, and every person who knew of the accord's existence. I will also need to examine Fairley's desk." Fairley's desk was a modest affair in a shared office on the second floor. A walnut writing desk, with 2 drawers, a blotter, an inkwell, and a small brass lamp. The other desks in the room were occupied by clerks who watched Holmes's examination, with the nervous fascination of men who understood that their colleague's disgrace might yet cast a shadow over them. Holmes went through the drawers with systematic thoroughness. Most of what he found was unremarkable. Stationery, pen nibs, a railway timetable, a pocket dictionary of French. But in the lower drawer, beneath a stack of blank memorandum forms, he found a small sheet of paper covered in a shorthand that Watson did not recognize. Holmes studied it for a long while. "Pitman's shorthand," he said at last. "Modified. Fairley used a personal variation, but the structure is standard." He traced the symbols with his finger. A figure, £200, and a date, the 13th of November, the night he was killed. He turned the paper over. There was nothing on the reverse. £200, Watson said. "That is a considerable sum for a clerk." It is precisely the sum that would tempt a man of modest means to do something he knew was wrong, Holmes replied. Fairley was not a traitor by conviction, Watson. He was a traitor by necessity, or by opportunity. Someone offered him £200 for that document, and he accepted. The question is who made the offer. He folded the shorthand note and placed it in his pocket. At the door, he paused and turned back to Harcourt, who had followed them upstairs in silence. "One more question," Holmes said. "Fairley's colleague, Arthur Denholm. You said they shared the archive. What is Denholm's disposition?" Harcourt chose his words with the care of a man walking across ice. "Denholm is competent, ambitious. He was passed over for a promotion that went to Fairley last spring. He took it badly. There were words between them, nothing violent, but sharp enough to be noticed. Denholm felt the promotion was undeserved." "And was it?" "Fairley was the better clerk, but Denholm was the harder worker. In a fair world, it might have gone either way. In the Foreign Office, fairness is a secondary consideration." Holmes nodded slowly. A man passed over, a shared archive, access to the same documents. He put on his hat. "Thank you, Mr. Harcourt. You have been more forthcoming than most men in your position would dare to be, and I suspect it cost you something. I will endeavour to see that it was worth the price." In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent for several minutes. Watson watched the streets of Westminster slide past the window. The grand facades, the iron gates, the quiet power of a government that could lose a document capable of reshaping European naval strategy and not notice until a man was dead. "The field narrows," Holmes said at last, "and simultaneously widens. Keaton had political motive to suppress the document. Denholm had professional grievance and the same access. The proximity of the maintenance shed to the Russian embassy suggests a foreign agent with the means and the patience to plan 3 days in advance. And somewhere in this web, a man named Edmund Fairley decided that £200 was worth more than his oath." He pressed his fingers together beneath his chin. "We have a stolen document of international significance, a murdered clerk, a darkened lamp, and a politician's calling card in a dead man's pocket. We have too many threads, Watson, and not yet enough to weave them into a pattern." He paused. "Tomorrow we begin pulling them, one by one, and we see which ones hold and which ones break." Watson looked at Holmes's face in the failing light. It wore the expression he had come to know better than any other, the restless, focused concentration of a mind that had found its quarry and would not rest until it had run it to ground. The cab turned onto Baker Street, and the lamps were burning. All of them. For Chapter 5, 5 Possible Enemies. The investigation that followed consumed the better part of 2 days, and Watson would later recall it as one of the most exhausting stretches of legwork he had undertaken in Holmes's company, and one of the most troubling, for the deeper they pushed into the lives of 5 individuals, the more Watson found that the case refused to simplify. They began with Marcus Keaton. The Member of Parliament received them in his study at his Westminster residence, a handsome room lined with political memoirs and framed photographs of Keaton shaking hands with men of consequence. Keaton himself was a broad-shouldered man of 45, with greying temples and the practised warmth of a man who had learned to make strangers feel welcome as a professional necessity. He offered them sherry, which Holmes declined, and chairs, which Holmes accepted. "I understand you found my card on the body," Keaton said, before Holmes had asked a single question. His directness was disarming, and Watson noted that it was meant to be. "I did," Holmes replied. "Perhaps you could explain how it came to be there." Keaton leaned back in his chair. "Fairley came to see me at the Foreign Office on the afternoon of the 13th. It was a routine matter. I had requested copies of certain correspondence related to the Mediterranean naval agreements. Fairley was the clerk assigned to retrieve them. We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I gave him my card so that he could send the copies to my office directly. That was the extent of our interaction. and the penciled note on the reverse of the card, a date and time corresponding to that afternoon. Fairley wrote that himself. I watched him do it. He said he would note the appointment so he wouldn't forget to send the documents. Keaton paused. I had no arrangement to meet him that evening. I had no reason to meet him on a bridge at midnight, and I did not kill him. Holmes studied Keaton for a long moment. You are aware that the Anglo-French naval accord is missing from the Foreign Office archives. The change in Keaton's composure was immediate but controlled. A tightening of the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes, the instinctive stiffening of a man who has just been shown a card he hoped would remain in the deck. "I am aware," Keaton said carefully. "Mr. Harcourt informed me this morning." "Then you are also aware that the accord contains details of a concession you negotiated without full cabinet approval. A concession that, if exposed, would end your political career." Keaton's face went very still. For several seconds the only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock. "I negotiated that concession because it was necessary," Keaton said, and for the first time his voice had lost its polish. "The French would not have signed without it. I acted in what I believed to be the national interest, and I stand by that decision. But I did not steal the document, and I did not murder the man who did. If that accord reaches the public, I will face the consequences, but I will face them in Parliament. Not on a bridge in the dark." "Where were you on the evening of the 13th?" Holmes asked. "Between, let us say, 10 o'clock and midnight." "At my club, the Athenaeum. I dined alone and left at approximately 11:30. The porter will confirm my departure." Watson noted the time. 11:30. Fairley had been struck at 11:47. The Athenaeum was in Pall Mall. A cab ride of perhaps 15 minutes to Gaslight Bridge in light traffic, somewhat longer in fog. The timing was not impossible. Watson saw Holmes note it too and file it without comment. Holmes said nothing further. He rose, thanked Keaton for his time, and left. In the cab, Watson asked whether he believed the man. "I believe he is frightened," Holmes said. "Whether he is frightened because he is guilty or because he is exposed is a question I cannot yet answer. But note the timing, Watson. He left his club at 11:30. Fairley died at 11:47. The gap is narrow but navigable. Keaton is not yet eliminated." They found Arthur Denholm at his desk in the Foreign Office, working late with the grim determination of a man who believes that visible effort is its own form of argument. Denholm was younger than Watson had expected, perhaps 28, with sharp features, dark hair worn slightly too long, and an expression of permanent dissatisfaction that seemed less an emotion than a fixture of his face. He did not rise when they entered. He did not offer them chairs. He regarded Holmes with the wary hostility of a man who has already decided that this conversation will go badly and sees no reason to delay the confirmation. "I know why you're here," Denholm said. "Fairley is dead, and you want to know if I did it. The answer is no, but I won't pretend I'm devastated." "You were passed over for promotion in his favour," Holmes said. "I was passed over because Harcourt preferred a man who agreed with him to a man who challenged him. Fairley was a clerk. I am an analyst. He filed papers. I interpreted them. But he smiled at the right moments and laughed at the right jokes, and that, in the Foreign Office, counts for more than competence." Denholm's lip curled. "I disliked him. I won't deny it. But disliking a man and killing him are rather different undertakings. Where were you on the night of the 13th between 11 o'clock and midnight?" Denholm hesitated. It was a longer hesitation than Keaton's had been, not a breath but a held breath, the silence of a man calculating what a lie would cost him. "I was at home," he said. "Can anyone confirm that?" "I live alone." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Mr. Denholm, a man with no alibi and a well-known grievance against the victim, is in a precarious position. If there is something you are not telling me, I would advise you to reconsider." "There is nothing to reconsider," Denholm said flatly. "I was at home. I read. I went to bed. That is all." Holmes nodded and they left. Watson could see from the set of Holmes's jaw that he did not believe a word of it. Clara Fairley received them in a modest sitting room in Clapham that smelled of dried lavender and financial anxiety. She was a woman of 27, thin and dark-eyed, wearing a dress that had been mended at the cuffs and pressed with more care than the fabric deserved. She had been weeping, not recently, but thoroughly, in the manner of a woman who had spent the past 2 days learning how to stop and had not yet fully succeeded. "My brother was a good man," she said, before Watson had finished expressing his condolences. "Whatever they are saying about him, whatever he may have done, he was a good man. He was the only family I had." Holmes was gentle with her, in a way that Watson had seen only rarely, and which always surprised him when it surfaced. He asked about Edmund's habits, his friends, his finances. Clara answered haltingly. Her brother had been quiet. He had few friends. He had worried about money, not for himself, but for her. "He knew about my debts," Clara said, dropping her gaze to her hands. "I owed money to a man, a moneylender in Lambeth, a great deal of money. I asked Edmund for help last month. He said he couldn't manage it. I didn't press him." Her voice broke slightly. "I should have pressed him. Perhaps if I had, he wouldn't have done whatever he did to get that money." Holmes asked how much she owed. Clara named a sum that made Watson wince. Not a fortune, but enough to ruin a woman of her means, and enough to explain why a brother might make a desperate decision. "And you inherit from your brother?" Holmes asked. "A small amount, his savings. It will cover the worst of what I owe. But not all of it." She looked up. "I did not kill my brother for his savings, Mr. Holmes. If you believe nothing else I tell you, believe that." "Where were you on the evening of the 13th? "In Hampstead, visiting a friend, Margaret Coulson. I took a cab there at 7:30 and returned home after midnight. Margaret will confirm it, and the cab driver, I remember his face, a red-haired man with a scar on his chin." Holmes thanked her, and they departed. The journalist Thomas Wren was the most difficult to locate and the least willing to speak. They found him at a chop house near Fleet Street, a lean, sharp-featured man with ink-stained fingers and the aggressive posture of a terrier that has been kicked once too often and has learned to bite first. "I don't talk to consulting detectives," Wren said. "I talk to sources, and you're not one." "I may become one," Holmes replied, "if you answer my questions honestly. I may become something rather less pleasant if you do not." Wren studied Holmes for a long moment, then shrugged. "Fine. I was near Gaslight Bridge on the evening of the 13th, around 10:30. I was meeting someone, a source, not Fairley, someone else entirely, on a matter unrelated to the Foreign Office. I left before 11. I crossed to the Southwark side and went home." "Your source's name?" "I'd rather go to prison." "That can be arranged," Lestrade muttered from behind them. He had joined them at Holmes's request an hour earlier, and his patience had not improved with exercise. Wren ignored him. "I protect my sources, Mr. Holmes. That's not negotiable. I was near the bridge, but I was gone before anything happened. I didn't see Fairley. I didn't know he'd be there. And I didn't kill him." "You were investigating leaks from the Foreign Office," Holmes said. It was not a question. Wren's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. "I investigate a great many things." "And Fairley, was he your source or your target?" Wren paused, and the pause was a beat too long for indifference. "Neither," he said. "I'd never spoken to the man in my life." Watson, watching from the side, noticed something that Holmes's direct interrogation may have been designed to obscure. Wren's right hand, resting on the table beside his plate, had tightened into a fist when Holmes mentioned the Foreign Office. It was a small thing, but Watson had spent decades reading the involuntary language of the body, the tells of pain, of fear, as of concealment, and a fist made beneath a table while the face above it remained composed was a language he understood perfectly. He mentioned it to Holmes in the cab afterward. "Yes," Holmes said. "I saw it. Wren is lying about something, though I am not yet certain which part of his account is the lie." He paused. "He is also left-handed." Watson frowned. "How did you—" "His ink stains. They are on the fingers of the left hand. His pen callus is on the left middle finger, and when he reached for his water glass, he reached with his left. A left-handed man, Watson, is noteworthy for one reason in this case. The blow that killed Fairley was delivered from the front and to the right temple. A left-handed assailant swinging naturally would strike the victim's right side. A right-handed man would tend to strike the left." Watson felt a coldness settle over him. "You think Wren—" "I think the evidence has not finished speaking," Holmes said, "and I think we must listen very carefully." The fifth interview was the one Watson had been least certain about, and which proved the most disquieting, though not in the way he had expected. Viktor Sokolov received them at the Russian embassy with the practised grace of a man for whom social encounters were a species of performance. He was tall, well-built, immaculately dressed in a dark suit that had been cut somewhere expensive, and he carried a walking cane, a handsome thing with a brass head shaped like a coiled serpent. His smile was warm on the surface and cold beneath it, and his English was flawless, touched only faintly with the consonants of his mother tongue. "Mr. Holmes," Sokolov said, extending his hand. "A pleasure. Your reputation is formidable. I confess I did not expect to entertain the famous detective at our humble embassy." "I am investigating the murder of Edmund Fairley," Holmes said, without accepting the pleasantries. "A clerk at the Foreign Office, found beneath Gaslight Bridge 2 mornings ago." "Yes, a dreadful business. I read about it in the Times, but I'm afraid I cannot see what it has to do with the Russian embassy." "Perhaps nothing," Holmes said. "Perhaps everything. I'm speaking to anyone who had contact with the Foreign Office in recent weeks. Your name appeared on a visitor register. I visit the Foreign Office regularly. It is part of my duties as a diplomatic liaison. I discuss trade, visas, consular matters. I did not know Mr. Fairley personally, and I have no knowledge of his death beyond what the newspapers have reported." Holmes's gaze moved to the cane that rested against Sokolov's chair. "A fine walking stick," he remarked. "A gift," Sokolov said easily. "From a friend in St. Petersburg. I carry it everywhere, a habit more than a necessity." "The head is brass." "It is. A serpent, the emblem of an old regiment, purely decorative." Sokolov's smile did not waver. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Mr. Holmes? I should mention that as a member of the diplomatic staff, I enjoy certain immunities that limit the scope of your inquiry. I mean no offence by this. It is simply the law." "No offence is taken," Holmes replied. "The law is clear on the matter. I thank you for your time." As they were leaving the embassy, Watson paused at the main entrance. Something had caught his eye, a small thing barely worth noticing, and yet his physician's mind had snagged on it like cloth on a nail. He said nothing until they were in the cab. "Holmes," Watson said. "Sokolov walks with a slight favouring of the right leg. Did you notice?" Holmes, who had been gazing out the window, turned sharply. "Explain." "When he rose to see us out, he placed his weight on his left foot first. When he walked, the right foot came down more lightly than the left. It was subtle, the kind of compensation a man develops after years with a chronic injury. He disguises it well, but I have treated enough old wounds to recognize the pattern." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Watson watched the calculation happen, the alignment of this new observation with the boot print in the maintenance shed, the left heavy impression that Watson had noted himself. "The boot print in the shed," Holmes said slowly. "A man of moderate height who favours his left side. That was your observation, Watson, and now you tell me that Sokolov walks with precisely that asymmetry." "I do? Then the boot print may be his." Holmes's voice was measured, but Watson could hear the tension beneath it, the careful restraint of a man who sees a pattern forming but distrusts its neatness. "And yet," he paused, "a man who mentions his diplomatic immunity before being asked, a man who displays his brass-headed cane openly as though inviting comment, a man who answers every question before it is asked. Sokolov is either precisely what the evidence suggests, a spy who killed a clerk on a dark bridge, or he is something considerably more interesting." "What could be more interesting than that?" Watson asked. Holmes looked at him with an expression Watson could not quite read. "A man who wants me to believe he killed a clerk on a dark bridge. There is a difference, Watson, and it may prove to be the most important difference in this case." The cab rattled on through the fog, and Holmes retreated into a silence that Watson recognised, the particular silence of a mind working at the very edge of what the evidence would support, unwilling to advance a step beyond it, and unable to rest until it found the ground to do so. Chapter 6. The Midnight Meeting. Holmes did not sleep that night, and Watson knew this because he heard the violin at 1:30. Not one of Holmes's usual compositions or the scraping improvisations that signalled restless boredom, but a slow, deliberate sequence of single notes, each one held for several seconds before the next, as though Holmes were testing the weight of individual sounds the way another man might test the weight of coins. Watson lay in bed and listened, and did not interrupt. There were times when Holmes's mind required silence from others in order to hear itself, and this was one of them. By morning, Holmes had made a decision. "We are going back to the bridge," he announced over breakfast, which he had again not touched. "Tonight, at midnight." Watson set down his cup. "At midnight?" "I want to see it as Fairley saw it. The same hour, the same conditions. The fog has been consistent all week. It will serve. I need to understand the physical experience of that bridge at the time of the murder. The distances, the visibility, the sound. Evidence tells you what happened. The scene tells you how it felt." They spent the day in Baker Street. Holmes paced. He smoked. He arranged the evidence on the mantelpiece in a line, the shorthand note with its figure of £200, a tracing he had made of the scratches on the lamp valve, a sketch of the wound on Fairley's temple, and a list of the 5 suspects with their alibis written beneath each name in Holmes's precise angular hand. Watson watched him return to this display at intervals throughout the afternoon, standing before it with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving from one item to the next like a man reading a sentence in which the grammar was sound, but the meaning remained elusive. At 1:45, they took a cab to Southwark. Gaslight Bridge at that hour was a different creature from the one Watson had walked in daylight. The fog had settled low and thick, pressing the lamplight down to tight halos that barely reached the railings. The river below was audible but invisible, a slow, muscular sound of water moving against stone, carrying with it the cold smell of mud and distance. Their footsteps rang on the iron deck with a hollow clarity that seemed to travel much further than it should, as though the bridge were amplifying each step and transmitting it outward into the dark. They walked to the centre. The dead lamp stood above them, unchanged, its glass intact, for its mechanism silent, its pool of darkness as complete as it had been on the morning they first saw it. Holmes had arranged with Lestrade to leave it unlit for the duration of the investigation, and it remained the single gap in the otherwise unbroken chain of light. Holmes stopped beneath it and stood very still. Watson stopped beside him. The darkness was remarkable. 2 lamps away in either direction, the bridge glowed with its usual amber warmth, but here, in this pocket, the world shrank to a radius of perhaps 4 feet. Watson could see Holmes's outline, the pale smudge of his face, the glint of his eyes. He could not see his hands. "Stand at the railing," Holmes said quietly. "Face the river." Watson moved to the eastern railing and placed his hands on the cold iron. The rail came to just above his waist, low, near as Lestrade had said, low enough that a man struck from behind could be tipped over it with relatively little effort, low enough that a man struck from the front would need only to be lifted and pushed. "Now turn," Holmes said. "Face me." Watson turned. Holmes was standing 3 feet away. In the darkness, he was a shape and nothing more, a column of shadow that might have been anyone. Watson could not see his expression. He could not see whether Holmes held anything in his hands. If Holmes had raised a weapon at that moment, Watson would not have known until it struck him. "This is what Fairley experienced," Holmes said. "He arrived at 1:45. He walked to this spot, the spot where the lamp had been extinguished, because this was the agreed meeting place. He stood in darkness and waited. And when the other man arrived, Fairley could not see him clearly. He could hear his voice, perhaps recognize it, but he could not see what the man carried in his hand. Holmes moved to the railing and looked down. The mud flat below was invisible in the fog and the dark, but Watson could hear the river lapping softly against it. "The blow came from the front," Holmes continued. "We established that from the wound, a strike to the right temple delivered by someone facing the victim. Fairley collapsed, and then the killer had a problem. The body was on the bridge deck, in a public thoroughfare. Even at midnight, even in fog, someone might cross the bridge. He needed to move the body." Holmes crouched and placed his hand flat on the bridge surface. He dragged Fairley, not far, 5 feet, perhaps 6. From where he fell to the railing, he dragged him face down, and this is how the mud came to be on the tops of Fairley's shoes. Watson felt the realization settle into place, with the quiet certainty of a key turning in a lock. He had wondered about the mud since Holmes first noted it at the mortuary, the thin crust on the upper surface of the toe, inconsistent with a fall, inconsistent with a stumble. Now the picture was complete. Fairley had been struck, had collapsed forward onto the bridge deck, and had been dragged by his arms or shoulders toward the railing, his feet trailing behind him, the tops of his shoes scraping across the wet surface. "This eliminates any remaining possibility of accident," Holmes said, standing. "A man does not drag himself to a railing and throw himself over. Someone moved this body. Someone with the strength to lift a grown man over a low railing and drop him into the river below, and someone with the presence of mind to do it quickly, in darkness, without leaving more trace than a smear of mud on a dead man's shoes." Holmes walked slowly along the bridge, counting his steps from the dead lamp to the nearest burning one. 14 paces, he said. In 14 paces, the killer moved from total darkness to visible light. He would have needed to compose himself in that distance, to straighten his clothing, to wipe the cane, to assume the posture of a man taking an evening stroll. 14 paces between murder and normalcy. He turned and walked back to the centre. The valuables were untouched. £7 in the wallet. The watch, even broken, was worth something. A common thief would have taken them. The killer did not, because the killer was not interested in money. He wanted the document, only the document. Watson had been standing at the railing, looking down at the dark water, turning the case over in his mind with the methodical attention he brought to a difficult diagnosis. A thought had been forming, not a deduction in the Holmesian sense, but a medical observation that had been nagging at him since the mortuary, and which now, standing in the darkness where Fairley had died, sharpened into something he could articulate. "Holmes," Watson said. "The blow. What of it? At the mortuary you said the weapon was heavy, smooth and rounded, brass, approximately 2 inches in diameter. The blow was delivered from the front to the right temple, by someone standing face to face with the victim." "That is correct." Then consider the angle. Watson stepped forward into the space between the dark lamp and the railing. I am a physician. I have treated head wounds from assaults, from falls, from riding accidents. The angle of a blow tells you a great deal about the man who delivered it. His height relative to the victim, his handedness, the arc of the swing. Fairley was a slight man, 5'7", perhaps 5'8". The wound was on his right temple. For a right-handed man to strike the right temple of a man facing him, he must swing across his own body, an awkward backhand motion that sacrifices power. The wound we saw was not the product of an awkward swing. It was delivered with full force, cleanly in a natural arc. Holmes had gone very still. Continue. A left-handed man, Watson said, standing face to face with his victim, swings naturally from his left to the victim's right. The arc is fluid. The power is uncompromised. The wound lands on the right temple with the clean, concave precision we observed. The man who struck Fairley was left-handed, Holmes. I am as certain of it as I am of any diagnosis I have ever made. The silence that followed was of the kind Watson had learned to value. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of a mind incorporating new data into an existing framework and finding that the framework must be redrawn. Left-handed, Holmes said quietly. Yes, the angle is consistent. The force is consistent. And Wren is left-handed. We established that from his ink stains. He paused. But so, Watson, is Denholm. Denholm? I observed it at the Foreign Office. He writes with his left hand. He reaches for objects with his left hand. The pen callus, the ink stains, identical in placement to Wren's. 2 of our 5 suspects are left-handed, and the evidence now tells us the killer must be one of them. Watson felt the ground of the investigation shift beneath him. For the first time since the case began, the field had genuinely narrowed, not through the elimination of alibis or the logical exclusion of motives, but through a physical fact written on the body of the dead man himself. Keaton, Watson said. Is Keaton left-handed? He is not. He signed a document while we watched, with his right hand, naturally and without hesitation. Clara is right-handed as well. She held her handbag in her left and gestured with her right throughout our interview. Holmes paused. Sokolov carried his cane in his left hand at the embassy. I assumed it was because of the right leg he favours, but a man who carries a cane in his left hand for support may also swing it with his left. 3 suspects, Watson said. Wren, Denholm, and Sokolov. All left-handed, all with questions unanswered. Holmes turned from the railing. In the faint light from the nearest lamp, his face was sharp and intent. Your observation has done more to advance this case than a day of interviews, Watson. We came to this bridge with 5 suspects. We leave it with 3. And of those 3, the evidence is beginning to speak with a very particular voice. He paused. Tomorrow, we eliminate further. We confirm or destroy every alibi, and we follow the one thread that does not break. They walked back along the bridge in silence. The 17 lamps burned steadily above them, each one a small assertion of order against the formless dark. The 18th remained unlit, a hole in the pattern, a silence in the sentence, a space where something should have been and was not. Watson looked back once more as they reached the Southwark end of the bridge. The dead lamp was invisible again, swallowed by the fog that had claimed it every night since the murder. It occurred to him that this was precisely what the killer had intended. Not just darkness, but disappearance. A place where a man could be struck and dropped and forgotten as though he had never been there at all. The river accepted this. The fog accepted this. The bridge, with its low railings and its patient iron, accepted this. Holmes did not. Chapter 7. The shadow in the gaslight. Holmes vanished the following morning. Watson came down to breakfast to find the sitting room empty, the fire unlit, and a note on the mantelpiece written in Holmes's hand. Do not expect me before evening. There are several threads that require my attention, and they will not bear the weight of company. S.H. It was not the first time Holmes had disappeared during a case, and Watson had long since trained himself not to take offence at the exclusion. But this time, rather than waiting idly at Baker Street, Watson made a decision of his own. The medical question of handedness had opened a door, and Watson intended to walk through it. He dressed, took a cab to St. Thomas's, and asked to see the police surgeon Hollins. What he wanted was the post-mortem report, specifically the precise measurements of the wound, the angle of the fracture, and any observations about the direction of force that Hollins might have recorded, but not thought significant. Hollins was cooperative, if puzzled. He produced his notes and allowed Watson to examine them. The wound measurements confirmed what Watson had estimated. A concave depression roughly 2 inches across, centred above the right ear, with a slight downward trajectory. The bone fragments were displaced inward and to the left. The downward trajectory, Watson said. You noted it here, a slight inclination from upper right to lower left. What does that suggest to you? Hollins shrugged. That the blow came from above. The assailant was taller than the victim. Or the weapon was raised high before the swing. Or, Watson said, the assailant was of similar height, but swinging from a natural left-handed stance. A left-handed overhead swing, delivered face-to-face, would travel from upper right to lower left across the victim's skull, exactly the pattern you have recorded. Hollins stared at the notes as though seeing them for the first time. I hadn't considered handedness. Few do, Watson said, but the body records it faithfully. He copied the relevant measurements into his notebook, thanked Hollins, and left. His next stop was less conventional. From St. Thomas's he took a cab to Lambeth, to the office of the moneylender to whom Clara Fairley owed her debts. The man's name, which Watson had obtained from Clara during their interview, was Jessup, and his premises were exactly what Watson might have expected, a narrow shopfront on a grimy street, with barred windows and a door that suggested business was conducted primarily with people who had nowhere else to go. Jessup was a small, careful man, with quick eyes, and the professional courtesy of a man who understood that his livelihood depended on knowing things about people that they would rather he did not know. Edmund Fairley, Jessup said, when Watson explained his purpose. Yes, I knew the name. His sister owed me £93. She'd been paying it down, slowly, but she was paying. I had no quarrel with her. Did Edmund ever come to see you directly? Once, perhaps 2 weeks ago. He came to ask about the terms. He wanted to know whether a lump payment would settle the debt and at what discount. And I told him I'd accept £80 flat. He said he'd think about it. And did he return? He did not, but he wrote to me, a brief note posted 3 days before he died. He said he expected to come into some money shortly and would settle the full amount. He asked me to hold off on any further collection against his sister until he had done so. Watson thanked Jessup and departed. In the cab, back to Baker Street, he sat with his notebook open on his knee and a growing sense of unease. The visit to Jessup had confirmed what they already suspected. Fairley had expected a payment, the £200, and had been planning to use it to rescue his sister. He had been a man driven not by greed but by love. And that distinction, while it changed nothing about the murder, changed something about the murdered. So he arrived at Baker Street at 4:30 to find Holmes already there, seated by the fire with his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together in the familiar cathedral. "You have been busy," Holmes said, without opening his eyes. "The mortuary first. I can smell the carbolic. Then south of the river, the mud on your left boot is Lambeth clay, not Suffolk. You went to see the moneylender." Watson did not ask how Holmes knew about the moneylender. He sat down and reported what he had found, the wound angle confirming left-handedness, and Jessup's account of Fairley's letter. Holmes opened his eyes. You have had a productive morning, Watson. More productive, perhaps, than my own, though mine was not without its rewards. He rose and moved to the mantelpiece. Let me tell you what I have confirmed. He held up one finger. First, Clara Fairley. I sent a Baker Street irregular, young Simmons, who has a talent for finding cab drivers, to verify her alibi. The friend in Hampstead confirms Clara's visit. The cab driver, a red-haired man named Doyle with a scar on his chin, confirms he collected Clara at 7:30 and returned her to Clapham shortly after midnight. Clara is right-handed, and her movements are fully accounted for. She is eliminated. A second finger. Thomas Wren. This required more delicacy. I visited Fleet Street in the guise of a retired civil servant with a grievance and an interest in speaking to the press. Through a series of conversations with Wren's colleagues, I established that Wren has been investigating corruption in the Metropolitan Water Board, a matter entirely unrelated to the Foreign Office. His source near Gaslight Bridge that evening was a water board engineer who has since confirmed the meeting to Lestrade on condition of anonymity. Wren was at the bridge before 10:45. He departed southward and did not return. Watson frowned. Then Wren is eliminated. His presence at the bridge is explained. His departure before the murder is confirmed by an independent witness. And yet... Holmes paused, and the pause carried weight. Wren is left-handed, and when I visited Fleet Street this morning, I learned something else. Wren has not always been a journalist. Before joining the press 5 years ago, he served in the Army, the Intelligence Corps. He was stationed in India and, or for a period, in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, Watson repeated. As a military attaché, he spent 2 years in Russia. He speaks the language. He has connections in the intelligence world that his current colleagues know nothing about. Holmes looked at Watson steadily. A man with intelligence training, who speaks Russian, who was on the bridge an hour before the murder, and who is left-handed. His alibi places him away from the bridge before the killing, but alibis, Watson, can be constructed. You think his departure was a feint, that he left and returned? I think it is possible. I also think it is possible that he is exactly what he appears, a journalist who was in the wrong place at a coincidental time, but I will not dismiss him yet. Holmes held up a third finger. Arthur Denholm. I sent a second irregular, Cartwright, to make inquiries in Whitechapel. Denholm claimed he was at home on the night of the murder. He was not. Cartwright located a man named Spicer, who runs an underground card game in a cellar off Dorset Street. Spicer confirms that Denholm arrived at approximately 10:30 and did not leave until well after 1 in the morning. He lost £11. 3 other players corroborate his presence. Watson sat forward. Then Denholm has an alibi after all. He has an alibi he was desperate to conceal. A civil servant at the Foreign Office already passed over for promotion, caught gambling in an illegal den in Whitechapel. The scandal would finish whatever career he has left. Denholm lied to protect his reputation, not to hide a murder. He is left-handed. But his movements that night are accounted for from 10:30 onward. The murder occurred at 11:47. He is eliminated. Watson looked at the list forming in his mind. Clara, eliminated. Denholm, eliminated. Wren, explained but not fully eliminated. That leaves Keaton and Sokolov, Watson said, and Wren, if his departure from the bridge was not what it appeared. Keaton's timing troubles me, Holmes said. He left the Athenaeum at 11:30. He is right-handed, which, after your excellent work this morning, should eliminate him. But I have learned today that Keaton is not entirely right-handed. He was born left-handed and was forced to convert as a child, a common practice among the upper classes. He writes and eats with his right hand, but his natural dominance is the left. Under stress, in an unplanned physical act, a man reverts to his natural side. Watson felt the complexity of the case deepen around him like water rising. Keaton, left-handed by nature, right-handed by training, the gap in his alibi, the political motive, and now the question of which hand he would use to swing a cane in the dark. And Sokolov? This afternoon I visited a tobacconist on Berry Street, a man named Felsted, who supplies cigars to several embassy staffs. Felsted told me a great deal, most of it trivial, but one detail was not. Holmes reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small sketch, quickly drawn but precise, of a hexagonal socket mounted on a short steel shaft, attached to a loop for hanging on a chain. Sokolov wears an ornament on his watch chain. His colleagues assume it is a decorative fob from St. Petersburg. Yes, it is not a watch fob, it is a valve key, modified, shortened and fitted with a chain loop, but unmistakably a gas valve key. The socket is marginally wider than the standard corporation issue, which would explain the scratches on the lamp fitting. Watson stared at the sketch. The evidence against Sokolov was accumulating with alarming precision. The cane, the boot print, the proximity to the shed, and now a valve key worn openly on his person. And yet Holmes had said something in the cab that Watson could not forget. A man who wants me to believe he killed a clerk on a dark bridge. Holmes, Watson said carefully, the evidence against Sokolov is almost too complete. The cane, the key on his chain, the boot print in the shed, the embassy's proximity. Every piece of physical evidence points to him, and he has done nothing to conceal any of it. He displays the cane openly. He wears the key on his watch chain. He mentioned his diplomatic immunity before you raised the subject. It is as though he has arranged the evidence around himself like a frame. Holmes looked at Watson for a long moment, and what Watson saw in his face was not agreement or disagreement, but something rarer, the expression of a man who has been thinking the same thought, and is surprised to hear it spoken aloud by someone else. "You have touched the nerve of this case, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "and I have not yet decided whether the nerve is real or whether it has been placed there for me to find." He moved to the writing desk. He took out 5 sheets of his personal stationery and began to write. 5 separate notes, each one brief, and each one folded and sealed with wax. "I intend to invite them all to Baker Street," Holmes said. "All 5 suspects, tomorrow evening, under the pretense that the missing document has been recovered." He sealed the last note and looked up at Watson. "When a man believes the game is lost, Watson, he reaches for whatever is nearest. I want to see what each of them reaches for, and I want to see who reaches first." He rang the bell for Mrs. Hudson and handed her the 5 letters. "Have these delivered tonight," he said, "and tomorrow, Watson, tomorrow we end this." Chapter 8. Holmes's Reconstruction. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street had been rearranged. Watson noticed it the moment he came downstairs that evening. The chairs had been repositioned in a loose semicircle before the fireplace, with Holmes's own armchair set apart and slightly forward, facing the others like the prow of a ship facing the sea. The evidence from the mantelpiece had been removed and placed in a leather case beside Holmes's chair, out of sight. The curtains were drawn. The fire was built high and burning steadily, casting the room in a warm, uneven light that made the shadows in the corners seem deeper than they were. Holmes stood at the window, fully dressed in his sharpest frock coat, his hair combed, his cuffs precise. He looked, Watson thought, less like a detective and more like a conductor waiting for the orchestra to take their seats. "Lestrade is downstairs," Holmes said without turning. "I've asked him to wait in Mrs. Hudson's kitchen with 2 constables until I call for him. He's not happy about it, but he has agreed." "You're certain this will work?" Watson asked. Holmes turned from the window. His expression was one Watson had seen only a handful of times across all their years together. Not the bright confidence of a man who has solved a puzzle, but the drawn, focused look of a man who is about to do something difficult and is not entirely certain of the outcome. I am certain of the truth, Watson, he said, but the truth in this case is not where I expected to find it, and the man I'm about to accuse has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that I would look in every direction except the right one. Watson felt a prickling unease. You know who killed Fairley. I have known since this morning, but I needed the day to confirm it, and the confirmation required me to revisit every assumption I had made since we first stood beneath that dark lamp. He paused. You will be surprised, Watson. I was. The guests arrived in the order Watson might have predicted. Clara Fairley came first, pale and uncertain, clutching a small handbag as though it contained something she was afraid of losing. She took the chair nearest the door. Arthur Denholm arrived next, stiff and suspicious, his coat buttoned to the throat despite the warmth of the fire. He sat as far from Clara as the semicircle allowed. Thomas Wren appeared third, notebook already in hand, his eyes scanning the room with the rapid assessment of a man who evaluated every space for its exits and its stories. He took the middle chair and said nothing. Marcus Keaton arrived at precisely the appointed hour, punctual as a man who had been trained to view lateness as a form of weakness. He nodded to the others without warmth and sat with his hands resting on his knees in the posture of a man who was prepared to listen but not to be surprised. Watson noticed, and filed away, that Keaton had not brought a walking cane. Sokoloff was last. He entered the room with the same practised ease Watson remembered from the embassy, unhurried, faintly amused, carrying his serpent-headed cane in his left hand. He surveyed the assembled company with a diplomat's measured gaze, offered a slight nod to each person in turn, and took the remaining chair at the far end of the semicircle. He placed the cane against his knee, its brass head catching the firelight, and folded his hands in his lap. Holmes waited until the room was still. Then he stepped forward and began. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. You are here because each of you is connected, by one thread or another, to the death of Edmund Fairley, a clerk at the Foreign Office who was found murdered beneath Gaslight Bridge 5 days ago. Each of you has been questioned. Each of you has provided an account of your movements and your relationship to the victim, and each of you, in one way or another, has been less than fully honest." No one spoke. Clara's hands tightened on her handbag. Denholm's jaw clenched. Wren's pen hovered above his notebook without touching the page. "Let me begin with what is known," Holmes continued. "On the night of the 13th of November, Edmund Fairley removed a confidential document from the Foreign Office archives, a memorandum detailing the Anglo-French naval accord. He carried this document to Gaslight Bridge, arriving at approximately 1:45. He was meeting someone, that someone had arrived before him and had taken a single preparatory action, the extinguishing of the gas lamp directly above the meeting point, creating a pocket of total darkness at the centre of the bridge. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and rested one hand upon it. At 11:47, Fairley was struck across the right temple by a heavy, rounded instrument, a brass-headed walking cane. The blow was fatal. The killer then dragged the body a short distance across the bridge deck, lifted it over the low railing and dropped it into the Thames mud below. He took the document from Fairley's person and walked away into the fog. He paused and looked at each of them in turn. "That is the sequence of events. Now let me tell you what each of you was doing while it unfolded, and what each of you has concealed." He turned to Clara first. "Miss Fairley, you are the simplest thread, and I will cut it quickly. You were in Hampstead on the night of the murder. Your friend confirms it. Your cab driver confirms it. You did not kill your brother. You are here tonight because you deserve to know who did." Clara said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on Holmes, with an intensity that Watson found difficult to watch. "Mr. Denholm." Holmes's voice carried a measured patience. You told me you were at home on the night of the murder. You were not. You were in a cellar off Dorset Street in Whitechapel, playing cards in an illegal gambling den. You arrived at 10:30 and did not leave until after 1 in the morning. You concealed this because a gambling scandal would end your career at the Foreign Office. Your bitterness toward Fairley is real, but it did not drive you to murder. It drove you to a card table in Whitechapel, which is a different kind of self-destruction entirely. Holmes stared at the floor. His face was white. Mr. Wren, Holmes turned to the journalist. You were near Gaslight Bridge on the evening of the murder. You were meeting a source, an engineer at the Metropolitan Water Board, on a matter of municipal corruption. You departed before 11:15 and did not return. Your source has confirmed the meeting. Holmes paused, and his voice took on a different quality, not softer, but more precise, as though he were sharpening each word before releasing it. But you are not merely a journalist, Mr. Wren. Before your career in the press, you served in the intelligence corps. You were stationed in St. Petersburg. You speak Russian, and you have maintained contacts in the intelligence world that you have never disclosed to your editors. Wren's face changed. The professional composure cracked, and beneath it Watson saw something unexpected. Not guilt, but fear. The specific, focused fear of a man whose secret has been named. I mention this, Holmes continued, not because it connects you to the murder, but because it explains why you were so reluctant to cooperate. And you feared that an investigation into your movements that evening would expose your intelligence background and compromise your journalistic cover. A cover you have maintained for 5 years while continuing to provide occasional reports to Whitehall. You are not a suspect, Mr. Wren. You are a witness who was too well trained to give a straight answer. Wren said nothing. He closed his notebook. Which brings us, Holmes said, to the 2 men who remain. The room contracted. Watson felt it. The tightening of attention, the narrowing of focus. Every eye moved between the 2 remaining chairs. Sokolov sat perfectly still, the firelight playing across the brass serpent on his cane. Keaton sat with his hands on his knees, his composure intact. To his expression, the careful blankness of a man who had spent a lifetime in rooms where the wrong reaction could end a career. For 5 days, Holmes said, the evidence in this case has pointed in one direction, toward Mr. Sokolov, the brass-headed cane. The proximity of the Russian embassy to the maintenance shed where the valve key was stolen. A modified valve key worn openly on his watch chain. A boot print in the shed consistent with his gait. A diplomat with the means, the motive, and the professional training to plan and execute an intelligence operation that included the murder of an informant. Sokolov's smile remained in place, but it had lost its warmth. He watched Holmes with the steady attention of a man who was listening very carefully. It is a compelling case, Holmes continued. So compelling, in fact, that any reasonable investigator would arrest Mr. Sokolov tomorrow morning, and any competent barrister would fail to convict him, because the evidence, for all its abundance, is entirely circumstantial, and because Mr. Sokolov enjoys diplomatic immunity that would shield him from prosecution in any event. Holmes stepped forward. But the evidence is not merely circumstantial. It is arranged. It has been placed, piece by piece, item by item, in a pattern designed to lead an investigator to one and only one conclusion. The cane, the key on the watch chain, the boot print, the embassy. Every piece of evidence against Mr. Sokolov is physical and visible. Every piece is on display. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not the hallmark of a guilty man. It is the hallmark of a man who has been framed. The silence that followed was absolute. Watson felt the floor give way beneath his assumptions. He looked at Sokolov, whose expression had changed. The diplomat's mask had fallen, and what remained was the face of a man who had been holding his breath for 5 days, and had just been told he could exhale. "Framed," Sokolov said. His voice was quiet. "Yes. Framed, Holmes confirmed, by someone who understood that a Russian diplomat carrying a brass cane near the scene of a stolen naval document would attract suspicion the way a flame attracts moths. Someone who counted on the weight of circumstance to do the work that evidence alone could not. Someone who knew that even if Sokolov were not convicted, the scandal would serve the same purpose. The destruction of Sokolov's network, the expulsion of a Russian operative, and the permanent burial of the real killer's identity beneath a mountain of diplomatic outrage. Holmes turned slowly to face the fourth chair. "Someone like you, Mr. Keaton." Marcus Keaton did not move. His hands remained on his knees. His expression remained composed. But Watson, watching with the physician's eye that had served him throughout this case, saw two things that betrayed him. The first was a single bead of perspiration that formed at his left temple and began a slow descent toward his jaw. The second was his left hand, the hand he had been trained since childhood to suppress, which tightened, just fractionally, into a fist against his knee. "That is an extraordinary accusation," Keaton said. His voice was steady. "On what possible basis do you make it?" "On the basis of what you are," Holmes replied, "and what you have done. Let me tell you what I have spent this day confirming." Holmes began to pace, not the restless pacing of uncertainty, but the measured stride of a man laying out a case. "You told me you left the Athenaeum at 11:30 on the night of the murder. You told me the porter would confirm your departure. He does. But I did not ask the porter only when you left. I asked him what you carried when you went. He told me you were wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a walking cane, a brass-headed cane that you have owned for years, a cane that you did not have with you when you visited my colleague Inspector Lestrade 2 days later to offer your assistance with the investigation, a cane that you have not been seen carrying since the night of the murder." Watson felt the shock of it, physical, visceral, like the first blast of cold water on a wound. A cane, Keaton's cane, not Sokolov's serpent, but Keaton's own instrument, carried out of a club at 11:30 and vanished from the earth. The porter described the cane's head as round, polished, about the size of a large coin. Brass. Not a serpent, Mr. Keaton. Something simpler, something you have since disposed of. Dropped in the river, perhaps, or buried somewhere between the Athenaeum and Gaslight Bridge. Holmes stopped pacing. "You left your club at 11:30. The murder occurred at 11:47. 16 minutes, precisely enough time to reach the bridge by cab." Keaton's composure held, but Watson could see the machinery behind it, the effort, the strain, the visible work of a man keeping his expression in place by force of will. "You knew about the accord because you helped negotiate it," Holmes continued. "You knew about Fairley because Fairley came to your office on the afternoon of the 13th, not merely to deliver correspondence, but because you summoned him. You had discovered, through your political contacts, that someone was attempting to sell the accord to a foreign buyer. You could not allow that to happen, not because you are a patriot, though you may be, but because the accord contained proof of your unauthorized concession. If it reached any hands outside your control, Russian, French, or British, your career would end. So you decided to intercept it yourself. You approached Fairley. You told him you knew about the sale and offered to act as the buyer. £200, the same sum the original buyer had offered. Fairley, who was desperate for money to save his sister, agreed. You arranged the meeting on the bridge, you specified the time, and 3 days in advance you walked into an unlocked shed on Emerson Street and stole a gas valve key. Holmes reached into the leather case beside his chair and produced the tracing of the scratches on the lamp valve. The scratches on the lamp fitting were made by a tool that did not quite fit. A standard corporation key, yes, but one wielded by a man unfamiliar with the mechanism. A lamplighter turns the valve with the practiced ease of 11 years. You turned it in the dark, on a bridge you had visited only to study, and the tool slipped. Repeatedly, The scratches tell the story of a man who was competent but not expert, a man who had the right tool but not the right hands. Holmes paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not with sympathy, but with the cold precision of a surgeon describing the path of a scalpel. You arrived at the bridge before Fairley. You extinguished the lamp. You waited. When Fairley came and handed you the document, you struck him with your own brass-headed cane, a single blow to the right temple, delivered with the natural left-handed swing that you were trained to suppress, but that reasserts itself under stress. You dragged his body to the railing and dropped it into the Thames. You took the document, and then you did something very clever, Mr. Keaton. You did the thing that nearly deceived me. Holmes turned to the room. He left his own visiting card in the dead man's pocket. The words landed like stones. Watson stared at Holmes, then at Keaton, and understood. It was the boldest stroke in the entire crime, Holmes said. A killer does not leave his own card on his victim. That is the premise I stated at the mortuary, and it is the premise Keaton counted on me to accept. By leaving the card, he ensured that I would find it, consider it, and dismiss it as too obvious to be meaningful. The card became proof of innocence precisely because it looked like evidence of guilt. It was a double bluff of the highest order, and it very nearly worked. But the card served a second purpose, Holmes continued. It established a documented, witnessed, routine explanation for Keaton's contact with Fairley that afternoon. A meeting about Mediterranean correspondence in the presence of clerks, entirely innocent. When I found the card on the body and asked about it, Keaton had his story ready. The card was a relic of an afternoon appointment. The penciled note was a reminder. The meeting was routine. Every element was prepared in advance, Watson. Every piece of the story was rehearsed. Holmes turned back to Keaton. And then you framed Sokolov. The room was absolutely still. You knew about Sokolov because you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. You had access to intelligence briefings that identified him as a Russian operative, information that most of London does not possess. You knew about his cane. You knew about his walk. You knew about his proximity to the maintenance shed. And you knew that a Russian spy found near the scene of a stolen naval document would absorb every investigator's attention like a sponge absorbs water. The boot print in the shed, Holmes said. I examined it again this morning. The print is consistent with a dress boot of moderate size, consistent with both Sokolov's gait and yours. But I also measured the stride length. The stride is 26 inches. Sokolov's natural stride, which I observed at the embassy, is 31 inches. Shorter than average because of his right leg, but still longer than the shed print. Your stride, Mr. Keaton, which I measured from the impressions you left on the gravel path outside the Foreign Office, is 27 inches. The shed print is yours. And the valve key on Sokolov's watch chain, Holmes continued. I had a Baker Street irregular make inquiries at the jeweller's shop on Regent Street, where Sokolov has his watch chain serviced. The jeweller confirmed that a new fob was added to the chain 8 days ago, 5 days before the murder. It was not brought by Sokolov. It was sent anonymously in a small box, with a note claiming it was a gift from the embassy staff. Sokolov, flattered, attached it to his chain without examination. He has been carrying the instrument that was meant to condemn him, placed there by the man who planned to use him as a shield. Keaton's composure broke. It did not shatter. It cracked, the way ice cracks under weight, the fracture lines spreading slowly from a single point of pressure. His left hand unclenched from his knee, his jaw loosened, and his eyes, which had maintained their steady political blankness throughout Holmes's account, went flat and dead, like lamps that had been extinguished from within. You cannot prove any of this, Keaton said. His voice had changed. The Polish was gone. What remained was something raw and stripped and dangerous, the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose and knew it. "I can prove the stride," Holmes said. "I can prove the timing. I can prove the jeweller's account. I can prove that you carried a brass-headed cane out of the Athenaeum at 11:30, and that it has not been seen since. And I can prove, because your porter was more observant than you gave him credit for, that when you returned to your club at 20 past midnight, your right cuff bore a stain that he described as dark like wine or ink. It was not wine, Mr. Keaton, and it was not ink." Keaton said nothing. "The cane is gone," Holmes said. "You have disposed of it. But disposal is itself evidence. An innocent man does not destroy his own walking stick. An innocent man does not return to his club with blood on his cuff. And an innocent man does not spend 5 days watching an investigation build its case against the wrong man and say nothing." Holmes extended his hand toward the door. Lestrade. The door opened. Lestrade stepped through, flanked by 2 uniformed constables. The doorway filled with the blue-black authority of the Metropolitan Police. "Marcus Keaton," Lestrade said, "I am arresting you for the murder of Edmund Fairley. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Keaton stood. He looked at Holmes. He looked at Sokoloff. He looked at the room, at the 5 chairs, at the fire, at the evidence case beside Holmes's armchair. His face held no expression at all. It was the face of a man who had played a very long game and had lost it, and who understood that the magnitude of the loss had not yet fully arrived, but was coming, as surely as the morning follows the dark. He walked to the door without speaking. The constables flanked him. Lestrade followed. The footsteps descended the stairs, measured, unhurried, final, and the front door opened and closed. Chapter 9. The truth beneath the lamp. The silence that followed Keaton's departure lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt considerably longer. The fire shifted in the grate with a soft collapse of embers, and the sound was startling in the stillness, a small domestic interruption in a room that had become something else entirely. Denholm was the first to move. He rose, buttoned his coat, and left without a word. His collar turned up against a cold that existed primarily inside himself. Wren lingered a moment longer, his notebook still in his hand, his pen still uncapped. He looked at Holmes, then at Sokoloff, then back at Holmes. "I don't suppose I could." "No," Holmes said. Wren closed the notebook, pocketed the pen, and departed. Clara remained. She had not moved from her chair. Her hands were still clasped around her handbag, and her face bore an expression that Watson could only describe as bewildered grief, the look of a woman who had come expecting to hear one name and had heard another, and who was now recalculating everything she thought she understood about the night her brother died. "Mr. Keaton," she said quietly, "Edmund went to him that afternoon. He told me he was meeting someone important, a politician who could help. He was excited, Mr. Holmes. He thought he was doing something that would fix everything." "He was doing something that would fix everything for you," Holmes said gently. "The £200 was Keaton's price for the document. Your brother accepted it because £80 would clear your debt and the rest would give you both a fresh start. He did not know that Keaton never intended to pay." Clara closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but she did not make a sound. After a moment she opened her eyes, nodded once to Holmes, and left. The room contracted. 3 chairs emptied. 1 remained occupied. Sokoloff still sat in his place at the end of the semicircle, the serpent-headed cane resting against his knee. His expression had changed. The diplomat's mask was entirely gone, and what remained was something Watson had not expected. Not anger, not vindication, but a quiet, watchful interest, as though he were observing Holmes from a new and more respectful distance. "You knew," Holmes said to him. "Not everything, but you knew you were being used." Sokoloff inclined his head. "I suspected." The watch fob arrived anonymously. In my profession, anonymous gifts are rarely gifts. I wore it because removing it would have signalled that I knew it was planted, and I wanted to see who had planted it and why. He paused. I did not know it was a valve key until you described it. I thought it was a listening device of some kind. A miniature mechanism, perhaps. The British are fond of such things. And the cane? Your display of it at the embassy, the open invitation to examine it? Sokolov's smile returned, smaller than before, and genuine. I carry this cane because it was my father's. I mentioned my diplomatic immunity because I knew that someone was constructing a case against me, and I wanted to establish the legal boundaries before you wasted your time. And I answered your questions before you asked them because I wanted you to notice that I was doing so. A man with nothing to hide hides nothing, Mr. Holmes. A man who is being framed must be transparent to the point of absurdity, because any shadow, any hesitation, will be read as guilt. Holmes regarded him steadily. You are an intelligence operative. I am a diplomatic liaison, Sokolov replied, and the emphasis on the title carried just enough irony to confirm what it nominally denied. I visit the Foreign Office, I discuss trade and consular matters. I do not recruit informants, and I did not recruit Edmund Fairley. He rose and picked up his cane. But I will tell you this, Mr. Holmes, as one professional to another. I would not have killed Fairley even if he had been my informant. A dead source is a useless source. Keaton killed him because Keaton is a politician, and politicians think in terms of problems to be eliminated. An intelligence officer thinks in terms of assets to be maintained. Fairly alive, delivering documents for years, is worth 100 times more than one stolen accord. Keaton did not understand that, because Keaton's only experience with secrets is keeping his own. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused and looked back. The valve key on my chain, he said. I assume you will want it for evidence. I will. Sokolov unclipped the small fob from his watch chain and placed it on the table beside Holmes's chair. A memento of sorts, he said, though not, I think, one either of us would choose to keep. He left. His footsteps descended the stair with the measured cadence of a man who had entered a trap and walked out of it, and who understood that the distance between those two things was the full measure of Sherlock Holmes. Watson and Holmes were alone. The fire had burned low. The shadows had grown. The room that had held 7 people now held only 2, and the silence they had left behind. "When did you know?" Watson asked. "Not Sokolov. When did you know it was Keaton?" Holmes moved to his chair and sat. He pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin and stared into the dying fire. "I began to suspect this morning," he said. "It was your observation, Watson, the handedness, that opened the door. You proved the killer was left-handed. Sokolov carries his cane in his left hand, but that is because of his injured right leg. When I observed him at the embassy, he signed a document with his right hand. He opened a door with his right hand. He is right-handed, Watson. He carries the cane on the left because the right leg requires the support to be on the opposite side. He is not, and has never been, left-handed." Watson stared. "But I saw him carry the cane in his left hand. I assumed—" "You assumed what the evidence suggested, which is precisely what you should have done. The error was not in your observation, but in its interpretation, and the misinterpretation was by design. Keaton chose Sokolov as his scapegoat in part because Sokolov's cane-carrying habit creates the visual impression of left-handedness. Anyone looking at Sokolov sees a man who uses his left hand as his primary hand. It is a masterful illusion, not created by Sokolov, but exploited by Keaton. And Keaton himself, born left-handed, converted in childhood. While the conversion is imperfect, it always is. He writes with his right hand, eats with his right hand, shakes hands with his right hand, but the natural dominance remains in the musculature. Under the stress of a violent act performed in darkness, With the adrenaline of murder coursing through him, Keaton's body reverted to its true nature. He swung with his left. The blow struck Fairley's right temple, and the angle, your angle, Watson, the trajectory you measured at the mortuary, confirmed it. Watson sat back. The full architecture of the crime was visible now, not the simple structure he had imagined with Sokolov at its centre, but a far more elaborate construction, with Keaton as both architect and occupant, and Sokolov as the facade designed to draw every eye. The visiting card, Watson said, the double bluff. He left it on the body knowing you would find it and dismiss it. It was the cleverest element of the entire crime, Holmes said. A killer's calling card, left in plain sight, transformed into proof of innocence by the very audacity of its placement. I dismissed it at the mortuary. You heard me do it. A killer does not typically leave his own calling card upon the body of his victim. I was right about the principle and wrong about the application. Keaton understood that the principle itself would protect him. He weaponized my own logic against me. And the frame around Sokolov, the boot print, the valve key, the proximity of the embassy. All constructed. Keaton visited the maintenance shed wearing dress boots and walked with his natural stride. 27 inches, close enough to Sokolov's adjusted gait to create ambiguity. He stole the valve key for the lamp, and he planted the modified key on Sokolov's watch chain through the jeweler, knowing that when the investigation turned to the Russian embassy, as it inevitably would, given the nature of the stolen document, every piece of physical evidence would point to a man who was too well protected by diplomatic immunity to be properly investigated. Holmes paused. It was, in its way, a work of art. Keaton built 2 layers of deception. The first layer, the visiting card, was designed to draw suspicion to himself and then be dismissed. The second layer, the frame around Sokolov, was designed to absorb the suspicion that remained. Between the two, Keaton would disappear entirely, hidden in the gap between a clue that was too obvious and a suspect who was too convenient. What defeated him? Holmes looked at Watson. You did. Watson blinked. I? Your observation about handedness. Without it, I would have remained focused on Sokolov. The physical evidence pointed to him. The logical evidence pointed to him. The circumstantial evidence pointed to him. But you proved that the killer was left-handed, and when I tested that fact against each suspect, the frame began to crack. Sokolov is right-handed. Wren is left-handed but was confirmed absent from the bridge before the murder. Denholm is left-handed but was confirmed in Whitechapel. That left Keaton, a man who appeared right-handed but whose childhood conversion concealed a natural left dominance that reasserted itself in the act of killing. Holmes smiled, not the thin, brief smile of professional satisfaction, but something warmer and more genuine. I have said it before, and I will say it again, Watson. You see, but you do not observe. Tonight I must amend that. Tonight you observed what I had overlooked. The angle of a wound, the trajectory of a blow, the handedness of a killer. It was the physician's eye that cracked this case, not the detective's, and I will not forget it. Watson said nothing for a long moment. The fire crackled softly. The wind pressed against the windows. There is one thing I do not understand, Watson said at last. The document. If Keaton killed Fairley to recover the accord and suppress the evidence of his unauthorized concession, then he has the document now. He can destroy it. His secret is safe. His secret was safe, Holmes corrected. It ceased to be safe the moment he was arrested. The document, wherever he has hidden it, will be found. And when it is found, it will confirm the concession he negotiated without cabinet approval, the concession that started everything. He killed a man to protect a political career, Watson, and the killing has destroyed it more thoroughly than the document ever could. Holmes reached for his pipe and began the slow ritual of filling and lighting it. There is a particular irony in this case that I find difficult to dismiss. Keaton murdered fairly to prevent the accord from reaching foreign hands. He framed Sokolov to divert suspicion, but if the frame had held, if Sokolov had been expelled and the document attributed to Russian espionage, the diplomatic consequences would have been severe. Anglo-Russian relations would have deteriorated. The naval accord would have been redrawn. The French would have demanded assurances. Keaton's attempt to protect one's secret would have created an international incident far larger than the secret itself. He did not think that far ahead, Watson said. No, Holmes replied. He thought only of the next step, the next bluff, the next piece placed on the board. He was a politician, Watson, not a strategist. He understood how to manage a room, how to control a narrative, how to leave the right card in the right pocket. But he did not understand that a detective is not a room to be managed. A detective is a man who looks at a dark lamp on a bridge and asks, not what happened here, but who needed this darkness, and why? The fire collapsed further. Holmes smoked his pipe and stared into the embers. The lamp was the key, he said. From the very beginning, the lamp was the key, not as a clue, as a question. Who needs darkness to do what they intend to do? A thief needs darkness. A spy needs darkness. But a politician needs darkness most of all, because a politician's crimes are committed not in alleyways but in drawing rooms, not with weapons but with words, and the darkness they require is not the absence of light but the absence of scrutiny. Keaton extinguished that lamp because he could not bear to be seen, not by Fairley, not by a passing stranger, not by himself. The darkness on that bridge was not a tool, Watson, it was a mirror, and Keaton looked into it and saw what he was willing to become. Watson wrote the words down. He did not know, sitting in the firelit room with the wind pressing against the windows, that they would become one of the most quoted passages in his published accounts. What he knew was that the case was over, and that something about it, something about the gap between what the evidence said and what the truth was, would stay with him for a very long time. Chapter 10. The Murder Beneath Gaslight Bridge. A week passed. The fog lifted on the third day, replaced by a cold, sharp wind that swept the Thames clean and left the city looking raw and exposed, as though a bandage had been removed from a wound that had not yet healed. Watson watched the change from the window of 221B Baker Street and thought that London looked better for it, not prettier, but more honest. The fog had been a co-conspirator in the murder of Edmund Fairley, and Watson was glad to see it go. The newspapers were less restrained than Watson had expected. The arrest of a sitting member of Parliament for murder was not a thing that could be absorbed quietly, and the editors of Fleet Street, Wren's colleagues, though Wren himself, to his credit, published nothing, filled their columns with the kind of breathless speculation that Holmes found distasteful and Watson found inevitable. The facts, as they emerged through Lestrade's carefully managed disclosures, were damning enough without embellishment. Keaton had been charged with murder. The Anglo-French naval accord had been recovered from a hidden compartment in Keaton's study desk, intact, uncopied, never transmitted. The concession he had negotiated without cabinet approval was now public knowledge, and the political machinery that had elevated him was grinding in reverse with the same implacable force that had once carried him forward. Lestrade called at Baker Street on the fourth day. He sat in the chair Sokolov had occupied and drank the tea Mrs. Hudson brought him with the slow, deliberate gratitude of a man who had spent 3 days filling out paperwork and was not yet finished. "The case is strong," Lestrade said. "The Athenaeum porter's testimony places the cane in Keaton's hand at 11:30. The same porter confirms the stain on his cuff when he returned at 20 past midnight. The jeweller on Regent Street has identified the box the valve key fob was sent in. Keaton purchased an identical box from his own stationer 3 weeks ago. And the stride measurements hold. Your measurements, Dr. Watson." Watson nodded. The measurements had been his contribution, Not just the handedness, but the follow-up work at the mortuary, the wound angle, the anatomical inferences that had narrowed 5 suspects to 3 and then, through Holmes's relentless logic, to 1. It was, Watson reflected, the most he had ever contributed to the forensic resolution of a case, and the satisfaction of it was tempered only by the knowledge that a man had died in order to make the contribution necessary. "And the Russian embassy?" Watson asked. Lestrade shrugged. The Foreign Secretary met with the Russian ambassador privately. They agreed that no diplomatic incident had occurred, since Sokolov was neither involved nor accused. The ambassador expressed his government's appreciation for what he called Mr. Holmes's thoroughness in establishing the truth, which is diplomats speak for "thank you for not blaming us." Sokolov? Still in London, still attending dinner parties, still carrying that serpent cane. Lestrade paused. "He sent a note to Holmes yesterday. I saw it on the mantelpiece." Watson had seen it too, a single line, written in a precise European hand on heavy cream paper. "The 18th lamp burns again. V.S." Holmes, who had been seated in his armchair throughout Lestrade's visit, reading a monograph on the chemical properties of brass oxidation and apparently paying no attention to the conversation, looked up at this. "He is not wrong," Holmes said. "The lamp has been repaired. I had Lestrade arrange it. A new valve, a new seal, a new wick. Cope will light it tonight on his rounds, and all 18 lamps on Gaslight Bridge will burn together for the first time since the night of the murder." Lestrade finished his tea and stood. "It's a good result, Mr. Holmes. A clean arrest, a strong prosecution. The public is satisfied, the French are placated, and the Russians are pretending nothing happened, which, as far as anyone can prove, is true." He put on his hat. "I don't mind telling you I was ready to arrest Sokolov. The evidence was all there, if it hadn't been for Dr. Watson's work on the wound angle." He let the sentence trail off. It did not need to be finished. They all understood what would have happened. An innocent man expelled. A guilty man walking free, and the 18th lamp burning above a lie. Lestrade left. The room was quiet again. Holmes set aside his monograph and picked up his pipe. He filled it with his usual care, lit it, and sat for a long while in silence, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "Tell me something," Watson said. "When did the case truly turn for you? Not the handedness. I know that opened the door. But when did you stop looking at Sokolov and start looking at Keaton?" Holmes considered the question with the same attention he brought to every question Watson asked. The attention of a man who understood that Watson's questions, however simply phrased, often pointed to the thing that mattered most. "It was the card," Holmes said. "The visiting card. I dismissed it at the mortuary as too obvious to be significant. A killer does not leave his own card on his victim. I believed that axiom entirely, and I was wrong. Not because the axiom is false, but because Keaton understood the axiom as well as I did, and used it against me." He drew on the pipe. "The moment I recognized the frame around Sokolov, the valve key sent anonymously, the boot print calibrated to suggest his gait, the cane displayed like a flag, I asked myself, who benefits from framing a Russian diplomat? The answer was not Russia's enemies in general. The answer was someone specific, someone who needed the investigation to look east, while the truth stood in the west. And the only person in this case who benefited from both the death of Fairley and the diversion of suspicion towards Sokolov was Keaton. He was hiding in the gap, Watson said, recalling Holmes's phrase from the night of the revelation, between a clue that was too obvious and a suspect who was too convenient. Yes, the card was the first wall, designed to be found and dismissed. Sokolov was the second wall, designed to absorb the investigation's energy. Keaton stood behind both walls, invisible, while the entire machinery of detection spent itself on the wrong man. Holmes paused. "It was the most sophisticated deception I have encountered in a murder case, Watson. Keaton was not a professional criminal. He had no training in espionage, no experience with violence. He was a politician, a man whose entire career had been built on the management of perception, and he applied those skills to murder with a precision that nearly defeated me. But it did not defeat you, Watson said. It did not defeat us, Holmes corrected. I would not have solved this case alone. Your medical expertise provided the single piece of evidence that the frame could not account for. The handedness of the killer, written in the angle of the wound and the trajectory of the blow. Keaton planned for every contingency. He planned for the card. He planned for Sokolov. He planned for the lamp and the shed and the boot print. But he did not plan for a physician who understood that the human body tells the truth even when every other witness lies. Watson felt the weight of the compliment, and with it something he had not expected, a sadness that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the man they had caught. Keaton was a man who had done a terrible thing for a comprehensible reason. He had overstepped his authority, feared the consequences, and killed to prevent them. It was not the act of a monster. It was the act of a man who had mistaken his career for his life and had been willing to end another man's life to preserve it. The tragedy was not that Keaton was evil. The tragedy was that he was ordinary, that the distance between an ambitious politician and a murderer was, in the end, no wider than a dark bridge at midnight. "What will happen to Clara?" Watson asked. "Her brother's savings will cover the worst of her debts. The remainder, I suspect, will be addressed by the sympathetic attention the case has drawn. She will not be comfortable, but she will not be ruined." Holmes paused. Fairley was a desperate man who made a desperate choice. He stole a document he should not have stolen and carried it to a bridge where he should not have gone. But he did it for his sister, Watson. Not for ideology, not for adventure, not for the thrill of betrayal. He did it because he loved someone and could not find another way to help her. I do not excuse his actions, but I understand them, and understanding is not the same as absolution. It is something quieter, and perhaps more useful. The wind shifted outside. The windows rattled in their frames. Holmes smoked his pipe and said no more for a long while. Watson thought of Gaslight Bridge, of the 18 lamps burning in their even chain, of the river moving below in its endless, indifferent patience, of the iron railings that had held one man's weight as he was lifted over them and dropped into the dark. He thought of the single extinguished lamp that had started everything, a deliberate absence, placed by a hand that understood what darkness could accomplish and what it could conceal. The lamp was burning now. Cope would have lit it an hour ago, on his regular round, with his standard key that fit the valve precisely and left no scratches on the brass. All 18 lamps would be shining together, a completed sentence, a restored pattern, a small order returned to a disordered stretch of river. It was not justice. Justice, Watson reflected, was a word that covered too much and delivered too little. Edmund Fairley was still dead. Clara Fairley was still alone. A politician's ambition had cost a clerk his life, and the document that started everything, the Anglo-French naval accord, with its fleet numbers and its patrol routes and its secret concession, would be redrawn and refiled and forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives it had destroyed. But the lamp was burning, and the man who had extinguished it would answer for what he had done, not in the diplomatic silence that Sokolov would have received, but in a British courtroom before a British jury, with the full weight of British law pressing down upon him. That was not justice, but it was something, and something, Watson had learned, was often the most that truth could offer. Every lamp was lit, every clue was placed, and the darkness which had served its master so faithfully on one November night had been defeated, not by brilliance alone, but by the patient, methodical work of two men who refused to accept the story the evidence was telling them, and insisted, against every appearance, on finding the story the evidence was hiding. Watson closed his notebook and set it on the table. The fire burned low. The wind blew. The lamps on Baker Street shone through the window in their steady, commonplace, unremarkable way, each one a small defiance against the dark, each one burning because someone had taken the trouble to light it. Holmes smoked his pipe and said no more.